Hello everyone, welcome to the first week of Conservation Law Enforcement. This week is very much just an introduction to kind of who and what conservation law enforcement officers are. So, kind of just a real kind of background information here. Conservation officers are certified peace officers, the same as regular police officers, same as traditional police officers. Now, their jurisdiction stuff varies a little bit from state to state, but they're all certified peace officers. They've existed in some capacity since about the 13th century, and then in the United States since the late 1800s. The first Yosemite Park is kind of credited as having the first ranger in 1866, and then Michigan was the first state to have a salaried state-level officer in 1887. Missouri has had conservation officers since about 1905, and they've been known by a variety of names, and they still are known by a variety of names: park rangers, conservation officers, conservation agents, conservation police officers, wildlife or fisheries officers, game wardens, special agents, or there's a lot of other names that I was called during my 9 years as a conservation officer that I really probably shouldn't say on this video. But even today, when you look, at different states and different agencies, you're going to see a variety of different names for natural resources officers. And their role, their responsibilities, and jurisdiction have all kind of evolved over time. Just kind of similar to how a traditional police role has changed over time. Those of you that have taken policing, CRM 250, I'm sure you'll recall, how the work of a police officer has changed, over time. So, kind of, while enforcing fish and game laws has always been part of their duties and their main duty, the role has evolved to include a lot more traditional kind of law enforcement activities, such as enforcing drug laws, driving while intoxicated, assaults. I know when I was a conservation officer, I got involved in a lot of different type of traditional law enforcement duties, from going on search warrants for meth labs, death investigations. I was involved in a couple of manhunts for people that had committed, multiple murders, and then, we had one particular case where a guy killed 3 people and then wandered off into the national forest. So the kind of activities, law enforcement activities that conservation officers get involved in, over time has really become, there's a lot more traditional kind of law enforcement activities that they're participating in. Then in addition to kind of in these law enforcement activities, conservation officers also routinely do educational programs for schools and other civic clubs. They do programs for hunting and fishing organizations. They do youth hunting and fishing clinics. They teach hunter education. They perform media activities, as far as writing newspaper articles, doing radio shows, television shows. They deal with sick and injured wildlife, visit with landowners about wildlife, fisheries, and forestry management. So they have this whole wide range of activities that they're responsible for, which makes them different than from a more traditional police officer. For example, in traditional police agency, just the everyday line officer is not conducting media relations. They have a specific person that handles media relations, for the department. But conservation officers, a lot of times in their particular assignment in the county where they're working, will be responsible for media relations there, at least locally. So if you read the 3 agent and action readings that are included for this week, they really talk about a variety of different activities that conservation officers participate in. All right, so how do they compare to other law enforcement officers? Okay, so if you talk about just kind of in policing terms, they all do law enforcement, they all do order maintenance, and they both do service activities. Well, obviously, because what they mainly do is different, right? So the types of activities that fall under those different categories are going to be quite different. So if you look at there's a PowerPoint slide included, and please do go through the PowerPoint slide because there's stuff included on there that's not in the readings. You'll be able to see the various differences between what conservation officers would do, say, for example, in order maintenance versus what a traditional police officer would do for order maintenance activities. And also, similar to traditional police officers, one of the defining characteristics of conservation officers is the ability to utilize coercive force, just like a traditional police officer. And that comes into play, not only when they're on duty, but also, when they're off duty. I know when I was working, I would be out somewhere and you'd hear some people talking about hunting. And as I got closer, they would just shut up, right? Because I had this ability to arrest them or, write them tickets or whatever, and they would stop talking about whatever they were talking about. Or you always hear, when you're at a restaurant or out somewhere, and this still happens, somebody will say, oh, if you don't, tell their kid, if you don't start behaving, I'm going to have them arrest you, that sort of thing. So this ability to use coercive force really does permeate kind of all aspects of an officer's life. All right, so conservation officers are also agents of social control, just like traditional police officers, but again, not necessarily in the same ways, right? So there's 3 types of social control. You have private social control, parochial social control, and public social control. Private social control is that which is conducted by your family, your friends, informal social groups. Parochial social control is exercised by organizations. So in a conservation officer situation, that would be organizations like sportsmen's clubs, the National Wild Turkey Federation, Ducks Unlimited, any of those kind of groups. So then finally, we have public social control. And this is the category that conservation officers would fall under, because this is the type of social control that's exercised by government agencies. So conservation officers contribute to social control through law enforcement and order maintenance. Okay, they protect the norms of society, but also protect natural resources through arresting those who violate the law. And also their presence, as officers or having conservation officers in the counties, is also intended to help preserve order and also serve as a deterrent and also provide a response mechanism if there's some kind of problem, right? If there's some kind of poaching problem or something, conservation officers can respond to that. So that's a form of social control. But like traditional police officers, the ability of any individual conservation officer to exercise high levels of social control is very, very limited. Okay? They have to rely on citizens to assist them in carrying out their duties, much like traditional police, right? You need citizens to report crimes, you need citizens to provide information on suspects, cooperate in investigations, all those kinds of things, right? Citizens are co-producers of conservation officer services. So what does this sound like, right? This sounds very similar to community policing, which it is, okay? And the interesting thing about conservation officers is they've been doing community policing forever, right? Way before it was something that traditional police agencies were looking at, before it was a buzzword. Conservation officers were already doing this in a lot of places. Because think about it, conservation officers, relative to police officers, there's very, very few of them, right? So they're assigned to whatever their assignment is. Like, for example, when I was working, I worked in 3 different counties. When I worked in Reynolds County, it was me and one other officer. When I worked in Pemiscot County, it was just me. And when I worked in Perry County, it was just me. Now, I did, work together with the sheriff's office and the troopers and the other officers in the county. But for what I was having to do, I had to rely on citizens to help me, right? It was just me, and a lot of these conservation officers the same way. It's just them in their jurisdiction, which could be a county. So they really do have to rely on citizens, and they've been doing community policing because of that forever, all right? So that's kind of a real quick hitter on kind of what their role is in society, and we'll get into all these things in more detail as the class goes on. So let's talk a minute about who are conservation officers and why do they do the job. So if you read the Eliason article, it outlines some of the reasons why people become conservation officers. Conservation law enforcement has traditionally been a male-dominated profession. But like traditional policing, there has been an increase in female and other minority participation that kind of coincides with the same kind of time period, but to a lesser extent. And one of the reasons why is because the nature of conservation law enforcement requires there to be some sort of necessary background in hunting and fishing. So that naturally limits who would be interested in those types of positions. So, unlike traditional policing, where that really anybody could want to come be a traditional police officer, conservation officers require some background knowledge about hunting and fishing and wildlife and all those types of things in order to do the job effectively. Also, a lot of conservation officers come from rural backgrounds, mainly because of this knowledge base needed of hunting and fishing and natural resources and that sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be from an urban area and have that requisite knowledge. I came from St. Louis, and I was able to effectively do the job. I know a lot of people that also came from urban environments that were able to be effective conservation officers, but kind of overall and generally, a lot of people that go into this type of work are from a rural background. Most people also that go into this have a desire to work in the outdoors and also a desire to protect natural resources. But neither one of those should be a shock to you as to why reasons why people might want to be a conservation law enforcement officer. But the desire to protect natural resources is very, very similar to those common motivations for entering traditional police work of wanting to make a difference, right? So, and then obviously there's a variety of other reasons. I think Eliason has an other category that he talks about how people kind of came into the job or fell into the job, or there's 1,000 reasons why somebody might end up doing the job that they're doing. Same way with traditional police officers. There's a lot of people that didn't go into police work early in life. They went and did something else, then they became so. There's a lot of reasons why people end up where they are doing the jobs that they do. But some of those more kind of basic reasons are kind of traditionally reasons why people went into conservation law enforcement. All right, so with that, I'm going to wrap it up for this week. Please be sure to do the readings, be sure to go through the PowerPoints, and then make sure that you complete the assignments that are included in the folder. All right, I'll see you next week.